after unwise decision after unwise decision after unwise decision, all these unwise decisions, he finally makes a wise decision, which is to ask God for wisdom. Well, that's what we're going to discover today. The reason he got that title is because something that happened at Gibeon. While he was still there, he just sacrificed his 1,000th animal at the altar on top of Gibeon, and something significant took place while he was there. What takes place? That's where we jump back in the story. 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said to Solomon, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Now that's a pretty significant offer to Solomon from God. In the middle of the night, in a dream, God comes to Solomon and says, ask me for whatever you want. Now notice what God doesn't say to Solomon. God doesn't say, ask me for whatever you want, and I promise that I'll give it to you. He doesn't say, ask me for whatever you want, and I guarantee I'm going to give you whatever you ask for. God's just asking. He's just seeing what would Solomon ask for. If you were to ask for anything, what would it be? So he's not making any promises. He's not making any guarantees. But if you fast forward in time and history, look at what Jesus says about God's desire to give good gifts to his kids. Matthew chapter 7, Jesus says this. He says, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? This is what Jesus says later on. But what we know about God is that he wants to give his children good gifts. So God comes to Solomon and says, ask me for whatever you want. I'm not making any promises or guarantees, but ask me for whatever it is that you want. Now, if God were to say that to you, if God were to come to you in a dream and say the same thing to you that he said to Solomon, ask me for whatever you want, what would you ask for? Would you ask for $1 million, $5 million, $10 million? Shoot, if it's anything, might as well be $1 billion. Maybe instead of wealth, you would ask for health. Because you probably heard the quote before, a healthy man wants 1,000 things, a sick man only wants one. So maybe you wouldn't ask for wealth, maybe you'd ask for health instead. Maybe you'd ask for a new truck. Maybe you'd ask for a new house. Maybe you'd ask for new clothes or new shoes. Or perhaps for some of the wives in the room or watching online, maybe you would ask for a shopping spree to Target. My wife might be tempted to ask God if he offered her anything she wanted. What would you ask for? If God came to you and said, ask me for whatever you want, what would you ask God for? God comes to Solomon in a dream and says, ask me for whatever you want. No promises, no guarantees. Well, here's what Solomon says. Here's how he responds. 1 Kings 3:6. Solomon answered God and said, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now Solomon says to God, he says, God, you were very good to my dad, David. And my dad was faithful and righteous and upright. Now, who are we talking about, David? If you remember David, King David, was he really faithful and righteous and upright? Because remember, King David had committed murder to cover up his adulterous affair. So would you describe David as faithful and righteous and upright? Probably not. But Solomon is describing his father as faithful and righteous and upright. Why? Well, you got to understand the context and the timing. The timing is that David has already passed away. So Solomon is talking about his late father. David had passed away in 1 Kings chapter 2. Now we're now studying in 1 Kings chapter 3. So David is already gone. He's already passed away. And Solomon, I believe what he's doing is he's being gracious to his late father. And I think that's cool because I'm a believer that I think every one of us deserves to be remembered for our best moments rather than our worst moments. You know, as a pastor, I get to officiate for a lot of funerals, and sometimes I stand behind a lectern or a podium or a table of some sort at a celebration of life or a memorial. And anytime I'm officiating for a funeral, I could go into detail about how many ways the person who has passed away screwed up. I could probably pull out a list of things. This person did this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, that wrong, that wrong, that wrong. But of all the funerals I have ever officiated, I don't think there's ever a single funeral where I have ever said anything negative about the person who has passed away. Because I believe that we all deserve to be remembered for our best moments and not our worst. Perhaps when it's my turn, when it's my funeral, memorial someday, whoever stands up on the stage and officiates for my funeral, they could have all sorts of things they could say negatively about me. Pastor Matt did this wrong and this wrong and this wrong. You don't have to wait for my funeral. You can just pay attention to the community. There's people that talk trash about me all the time. But my hope is that when it's my memorial or celebration of life, any one of you could say all the negative things, all the stupid things I've done in my life, but I would hope that I would be remembered for the best moments rather than my worst. I would hope that for all of us. I think that's what Solomon is doing for his late father, David. He goes to God and says, you were very kind to my dad, David, who was faithful and righteous and upright. Was David those things? Part of his life. I don't know if I would have described him that way, but Solomon, his son, chose to describe his late father in that way. And then Solomon continues talking to God. 1 Kings 3:7. He says, now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. In other words, he's saying, you allowed me to become the king. My dad was the king, and now you've allowed me to become the king. And then listen to what Solomon admitted to God next. He said, but I am only a little child, and I do not know how to carry out my duties. I love his humility here. Solomon is the king of Israel, and he's saying to God, he's admitting to God, he's like, listen, I'm the king. You've allowed me to be the king, but I'll be honest with you, God, I don't know how to do my job. I don't know how to carry out my duties. I love the humility he demonstrates. And then he says this, verse 8. He says, your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. In other words, Solomon's saying, listen, I'm the king, but I'm just one of the people. I'm one of the many. There's so many people who are Israelites who are here in your land. I'm just one of them. I happen to be the king, but I don't know what I'm doing. And then finally, Solomon answers the question that God had asked. God had asked him, ask for anything you want. And finally, he answers that question. Verse 9, Solomon says to God, he says, so give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? Finally, Solomon makes a wise decision. After unwise decision, after unwise decision, after unwise decision, all these unwise decisions, he finally makes a wise decision, which is to ask God for wisdom. That's one of the best things you can ever do. One of the smartest things you can ever do. In fact, if you're taking notes today, write this down. The wisest thing you could ask God for is wisdom. The wisest thing you can ask God for is wisdom. But it's